Hello, I'm Toycat, and did you know Japan is the country to the east of the Koreas, but it's also a country which is to the north of the Koreas, as well as to the west and to the south. This sounds impossible until you realize just how big Japan is and see it on a map. This is one of those facts that will not help you anywhere in your life, but if you're like me and like geography, it's the sort of thing that sticks with you anyway, and given that it's late at night, probably as you're watching this, I think you would love to see some weird geography facts which will stick with you despite providing very little value, except some of these actually can be useful, such as knowing that you can walk from South Africa to Chile without ever having to catch a boat or a plane. If you're scared of catching forms of transport that are beyond your own 2 feet, then you could walk straight between these places. It seems impossible because of the Russia-Alaska gap, although, fun fact, Russia and the United States are actually very close together. One of these islands is Russian and one of them is the United States, but still you can see there is a big body of water here, but it actually freezes over at various different points. So if you wanted to walk from Wales to Lavrentia in a straight line, you actually could, and interestingly enough, it is very hard, but it has been done. In fact, in 2006, Carl Bushby actually did precisely this. In March 2006, Bushby and French adventurer Dimitri Kifia crossed the Bering Strait on foot, walking across a frozen 56-mile section in 15 days. I cannot imagine what that is like. Are you camping on the middle of what is just a frozen ocean? But more interestingly is the fact that by entering Russia on foot, he was actually detained in the village of Yulen, which is just over here. Fun fact, he was detained because he entered Russia illegally. And interestingly enough, beyond that, is he wasn't deported for this. He had held an appeal and they said, yeah, I guess fair enough. You did cross the border illegally, but there's no legal border crossing for you. And so he continued walking and managed, his goal was to walk to Hull, England in 2009, but it looks as though the pandemic seems to have stopped some things, and then the Ukraine war, and you know, he's having terrible luck, but one day he'll make it to Hull and have even worse luck because he'll be in Hull at that point. Anyway, an interesting thing to mention right here is the fact that Russia and the United States have a bit of a icy relationship, you might be able to say, and one of the weird parts about that is the fact that did you know the world is actually divided into 5 lines of latitude. These, trust me, this relates to the US and Russia, because there are 5 lines of latitude. The top one is the most famous because this is the Arctic Circle, the bottom one is the Antarctic Circle, and then there is the Tropic of Cancer, which represents this area right over here. Why is this important to know? Well, interestingly, the Tropic of Cancer is actually, you know, the line for the Tropic of Cancer is the specific southernmost line where member states of NATO are obliged to come to the defense of a territory, meaning anything south, NATO states are not obligated to come to, which is really interesting because looking at it on a map, every NATO state, that is the US, Canada, and the majority of European countries, every NATO state is above the Tropic of Cancer, but there are some pieces of territory that are specifically below it. The most notable of these all would have to be the US state of Hawaii. If this is invaded by any foreign power, then all of the rest of NATO, Canada included, can say, we signed a treaty that excluded that. But even more interestingly, the case where this has happened would be the Falkland Islands. These were invaded by Argentina, and every other member of NATO said, we didn't agree to defend them, and so the UK had to go in by themselves, defending the Falkland Islands, which is a weird, honestly, a place that is weird on so many levels on its own right. It's a bunch of British people living on some previously uninhabited islands that feel like they should be Argentinian if you were to look on a map, but Argentina has a lot of fun things. We'll come back to them later in this video, but yeah, interestingly enough, this also means, so the UK and the United States and also France aren't protected by this because there are all sorts of weird French islands around the world, such as Réunion, or indeed we could talk about French Caledonia. I want to talk about French New Caledonia a whole bunch because it's basically a part of France that they want to get rid of, and they keep trying to get them to hold independence votes, but they keep on not voting for that same independence. But we'll come back to they're called the Loyalty Islands, and loyalty means you don't vote for independence even when it's really desperate that you should. Next up, let's talk about the fact that, you know, when we talk about borders, we usually talk about these like little dotted lines on a map that don't really represent anything besides a gap in political control, but did you know sometimes borders are quite physical? And a fun example of this would be in Australia, where, so this is from the ABC, which I assume is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. They have an article about the big fence in Australia. This is something that is real, and it's there because of the dingo, which is basically a type of dog native to just Australia. It was a big problem for farmers, and so what did they do? They did the only logical thing, and they made a border fence. So this is where the border fence goes to and from. It crosses the entire continent and splits it in two. Interestingly enough, on the northwest side of this, there are way fewer kangaroos, even though dingoes don't seem to massively kill kangaroos, their existence does lower the population, and on the southeast side there are far too many kangaroos, and so fun fact, the animal which has way too much international recognition. You ever think about how everyone in the world knows kangaroos, even though they exist in one tiny corner of it where, like, 25 million people live? But anyway, besides the point, this animal which has far too much recognition in all of our hearts and brains is found in larger quantities, which means the people who live in the suburbs of Sydney and Melbourne will see kangaroos. And why? Fun fact, I only learned about this when I went to Australia. There are some people there who consider themselves kangatarians. That is to say that they are vegetarian because they don't believe in the slaughter of animals, except for kangaroos, which are a bit of a menace, so they'll eat those. I don't think kangaroo tastes very good. So they do mean it for ethical reasons, or they're at least very fun. Speaking of very fun, would you like to talk about this one? What divides the red and the blue? Well, fun fact, it is the New World and the Old World. I know New World sounds like a thing that you do in a video game, but there is in fact a way to divide the world in two, which is more or less the places where the majority of population on this planet has lived for the majority of the time that humans have existed, and then there is the New World where that hasn't been true. There are people who are native to the blue areas who generally got there a lot later than people who basically the world's spawn point is Africa, and slowly people spread out. Because Africa, Asia, and Europe are all directly connected by land, people could spread across all three of these continents very easily, but getting to the blue was much harder, and so the native populations were much lower, which is why nowadays all of the blue continents have populations which are majority from Europe. This is something that fascinates me, because you'd figure, like, well, logically this continent would be majority people from Asia, right? But nope, majority people from Europe, majority people from Europe, majority people from Europe, and there are only a few specific exceptions. Although first I want to point out, while I was looking for a map of the New World versus the Old, the only thing that would come up is New World wines and Old World wines, and so just this isn't related to the video, but I learned about this and I think it's interesting anyway. Did you know that in the Old World, in Europe, Asia, and indeed in Africa, there is an emphasis on the location and the winemaker, and there are usually some traditions, some culture, and it's made to accompany food. I think this is the dumbest thing, like, yeah, you know what really it goes with this fish is some sour grape juice, but in the New World they prefer bigger body wines with more alcohol that can stand alone, and they've got little to no oversight with more variety. That's not very useful, but I learned about that just before making this video, and hopefully you know about it now too. Anyway, another interesting thing is the fact that if you look at the New World, the countries in blue, the majority of these countries are European, but there are exceptions. So one of the biggest ones would be Guyana, which is majority populated by people from South Asia. There is a very interesting tale behind that. There is obviously the Caribbean, which is majority populated by, it's called Afro-Caribbean, that is to say African people in the Caribbean, who were there maybe less willingly than Europeans who are across the rest of the continent. Although, that isn't to say that we don't unwillingly put Europeans places too. But anyway, that said, let's now move on to the next fun fact. Did you know that Antarctica has time zones? It makes no sense that Antarctica should have time zones, because time zones basically represent your offset, and it's there. Time zones don't work at the bottom of the world. There is basically no in the summer. There are endless days. It is something like 3 months of direct sunlight in the summer. I guess it's Antarctica, so 3 months of direct sunlight in the winter, and then 3 months of darkness in the summer. And it's the reverse in the Arctic region. If you're at the very northern tip of Greenland or Svalbard, there are lots of days where you get 23 hours and 50 minutes of sunlight, and then there are nights in winter where you get 10 minutes of daylight. It is brutal the way that the tips of the planet Earth, and because of the fact that you're at the very bottom, time zones don't make any sense, but we have them anyway. Why is that the case? Because Antarctica is officially neutral and belongs to no one, but lots of countries claim it anyway, and so the practice is that while you're in a country's slice, you use that country's time zone, despite there being very little geographic difference between these places. Seriously, on Google Maps, it looks like Antarctica is so big because they're using I think it's called like the equirectangular projection, or the Mercator. But if you actually measure the distance between two places, you'll see like, oh, wait. Wow, what's it doing going from there to there? The Antarctica is not as big as it might seem. To go from one side to the other is just 2,600 kilometers. And to put that in perspective, I guess, to go from one side of China to the other, which looks very small, is also, is way more, is about 4,100 kilometers. So from Beijing, just to go to Tibet, let's say, the very border is about the same. So halfway across China, or the whole way across this wall of ice, Isn't that crazy? The other crazy thing, by the way, when you're talking about time zones, because this is interesting as heck to me, but what's also interesting as heck is the fact that daylight savings is a very, very weird concept. Most of you watching this video will be from places where daylight, we just set the clocks back because we want more daylight, because we control daylight with our clocks. Rant over. That's how it works. Did you know that the majority of places that do daylight savings are fairly north up? I recently was fascinated by the Cayman Islands. It is one of the places which is on the Eastern time zone for the United States, except when the Eastern time zone does daylight savings, and so does Central, at which point it moves an hour west. Even though the Cayman Islands is perfectly lined up with Miami, Miami's time zone changes back and forth, whereas the Cayman Islands does not. Wow, isn't that interesting? There's a part of the UK that doesn't use daylight savings. It's also incredibly close to the equator, so close by, in fact, that you might notice I'm slightly pink in this video. I might have made a fun trip there for unrelated video reasons. Speaking of the Cayman Islands, wait, actually, speaking of the Cayman Islands, one of the other interesting territories around here, because these two islands belong to the Caymans, and this is Jamaica. Jamaica. But what you might not know is that there is a very disputed bank over here. Lots of countries have a claim to it, and Google has changed the image of this bank since I started this channel to look like this, so that you can, because obviously a lot of countries want to claim that it's land. This is something which is a very politically charged decision, because if you look on a map, it looks something more like this. It's like, well, I mean, there is something there sort of permanently. No one lives there, but lots of people claim it, because if there was oil to be found anywhere nearby, it would be valuable, and you better believe that the US has a claim as a result of that. Anyway, so with that said, let's not talk about oil in the US. Let's go back to daylight savings. I love daylight savings in this map, because lots of places do say, yeah, we're not going to do daylight savings, and so you get a very, very weird mishmash on this map. So Russia uses permanent summertime. That's why this gap over here exists. And also, interestingly enough, is the fact that it looks like Labrador, parts of it don't do daylight savings, but other interesting little parts right here is if you look at Saskatchewan, you might assume, looking at this map, that Saskatchewan has some really weird borders, like look at this and look at this, but even more interesting is the fact that no, Saskatchewan is this weirdly almost perfect rectangle. I'd say almost perfect. I'm just saying, we could have made it a rectangle. Was it really that important that this land belonged to Manitoba and not to... Anyway, so Saskatchewan is an almost perfect rectangle. It looks like a perfect rectangle on a map. It teases you, and then at the last minute, Canada says, nah, we don't believe in perfectly straight lines here. But interestingly enough, you can see Saskatchewan looks like this. So why does Saskatchewan appear like this on the daylight savings map? It's because around the areas of Lloydminster, that is a town which is half in one province and half in the other province. In Lloydminster, they decide to keep daylight savings for the whole of this place, just to keep things even, which I guess makes some sense. The rest of Saskatchewan is just on permanent daylight savings time, which is an interesting idea. If you really believe that daylight savings is so important, why do we ever go back to the old system? Why don't we just have permanent daylight savings time? Or, better yet, why don't we adjust our life so that if we think that having sun at 4 p.m. rather than 3 p.m. is important, why don't we just adjust our day, like going to work an hour earlier? We are the ones who decide waking up at 7 or waking up at 8, right? We are the masters of our own destiny, and so we don't need to change the clocks to change our lives, but apparently we do. Speaking of things we gotta do, they don't do it in Arizona, which is the only one of the contiguous US states not to do so, except they do it, and this is that crazy fact, right? In Arizona, there is no daylight savings, except for the Navajo Nation, where there is daylight savings, except for the Hopi Reservation, which is entirely an enclave inside of the Navajo Reservation, which obviously does not do that. By the way, the Navajo Nation is absolutely ridiculously sized. I actually visited it once, as a fun fact. I tried some food. I think it was called fry bread. Very, very good. Would recommend it. It's they call it a nation, which is even more interesting because it's a nation you can just drive into. But there's lots of nations you can just drive into. But we'll talk about those later. Next up, I want to talk about this. Time in Saskatchewan. Did you know that they have permanent daylight savings time, except for those weird shared cities, which means that when you look at the map, it looks like this, for North America, which I'm just saying. At some point, do we just decide we get to make our own time zones? Also, did you know that Canada goes surprisingly east? A part of Canada, Newfoundland in fact, has a 3.5 time zone offset. It is one of the very few half time zone offsets in the world, but you can see it's right here. Realistically, they should just be -3, right? Like St. Pierre and Miquelon, but you know, I digress. The important thing to note about the Newfoundland, though, is the fact that it's really, really far east. You don't realize till you're looking at a map. I was in North Carolina recently, and it's on the east coast of the United States, which is as far east as North America goes, if you think about it in the abstract, if you just see a map of the US. But Canada goes so far east. Not only does Canada go further west than the United States, as you can see all the way out over here. Wait, no, actually, I guess if you count Alaska. I guess if you count Alaska as part of the United States, you count Hawaii. And I guess if you count Hawaii as part of the United States, you count Guam, which means, technically speaking, actually, you know, I'm going to correct myself on the fly here. Did you know, because of Guam, and indeed the other territories that the US owns over here, the US actually goes much further east than Canada. So Canada goes all the way out to Newfoundland, like St. John's, which is over here, the first discovered part of North America. There's also some fun town names over here. But yeah, did you know that although Canada only goes out this far, about 3.5 hours behind London, Guam goes a solid 8 hours ahead of London, and so, you know, the United States does go further east and west than Canada. But my point here is to say that if you look at the east coast of North America, and we stick to just that continent, then you can discover something very interesting, which is to say that looking at the furthest east point here, it's so far east of where the US ends, but still the furthest east point in Canada is about the, furthest east point of America is about halfway through South America. There is still much more of South America, and conversely, the furthest west point in South America, if you go all the way here to Peru, or even if you want to be crazy and you want to start using the islands out here, and let's be honest, you don't want to. If you want to use the Galapagos or anything else, you still don't get anywhere near the middle of the North America. North America and South America look like they're just stacked one on top of each other, and the fact that we say North and South kind of implies that way, but it's not the case. Speaking of not being the case, did you know Northern Ireland is not the northernmost part of the island of Ireland? Wow, that is fun. You know what's also fun is this whole little area over here. There's a fun controversy in Ireland about what do you refer to the regions of Ireland as, because Ireland fully claims not just their country, but also the island as a whole. And so if you live in Northern Ireland, you live legally in the United Kingdom, I guess internationally recognized as the United Kingdom, but you can also apply for an Irish passport. This is a kind of agreement between the UK and Ireland, and another part of this agreement means regardless of whether you have an Irish or a British passport, you can live anywhere inside the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, which means that if you have an Irish ancestor, you can live in the UK. There are very few examples of countries like this. I guess you could point to any EU member state, but besides Italy, there aren't many that will give you super far back generational ancestors this way. But fun fact, if you, just by having a relative who had at some point someone who was above them, their father or grandfather or whatever, by having someone who was born on the island of Ireland, you can get Irish citizenship, which you can use to live in an entirely different country. You could also use it technically if you want to be that person who's like, the Isle of Man is sort of like a country. You can live in a third country yet. And also, because Ireland is a member of the EU, you could find out that you have an Irish grandparent and then go live in Estonia, even if you're born in Peru. Fun fact. Is that a fun fact? I hope that it is, because this has been a bunch of fun facts on the second channel. If you like geography, if you're just as fascinated as I am, consider subscribing, because this is where I like to talk about my weird niche interests. I'll be honest, whenever I'm traveling, whenever I'm with anyone, I have to bring up one of these facts. I'll pull out a map and they'll be like, oh, that is kind of interesting, I guess. And so I made this video just to put it all in one place. Hope you found that interesting. If not, then whew, poor use of your last 19 minutes, huh? Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed this video, because if not, second channel, don't care. Bye.